On the night of November 2nd, 2023, the glittering skyline of downtown Chicago was preparing to play backdrop to one of the city's most exclusive charity galas hosted annually by philanthropist and public figure, Veronica Hargrove, a woman often described by those close to her as radiant, driven, and meticulously composed. Veronica had been found lying on her left side, with her robe slightly askew, a shallow head wound bleeding steadily into the rug beneath her temple. But there were also faint ligature marks around her neck, not deep enough to indicate strangulation as the cause of death, but suggestive of an attempted effort to asphyxiate or immobilize her. The medical examiner's report finalized 2 days later. Estimated time of death between 2:30 and 3:10 p.m., with the ultimate cause ruled as blunt force trauma to the left parietal skull, consistent with a strike from a broad, heavy object with a metallic edge. Detectives noted an important detail. A distinctive lamp from Will Hargrove's home office, known from photos and social media posts, was missing. The penthouse showed no signs of forced entry, nor any evidence of a struggle beyond the immediate vicinity of the body. Expensive jewelry on the vanity remained untouched. Cash and electronics sat in plain sight. Veronica's phone, however, was missing, and so was the champagne bottle she had intended to serve to early arriving guests, seen just that morning chilling in a silver bucket by the bedroom window, according to Rosa Montoya. These absences, combined with the calculated neatness of the surrounding rooms, gave investigators their first indication that the murder was likely personal and staged to avoid panic or suspicion. Will Hargrove, upon arriving back at the penthouse at 4:11 p.m., claimed he had spent the day at Varian's headquarters in the West Loop. Security logs confirmed his keycard activity from 9:59 a.m. until 3:45 p.m., but surveillance footage revealed a 35-minute window from 1:52 p.m. to 2:27 p.m., where he left the building, captured briefly on a rear exit camera, before disappearing into the city on foot. When asked by detectives about that window, Will claimed he had gone for a walk to clear his head, adding that he had been overwhelmed with anxiety due to both the gala and an upcoming contract review with the Department of Energy. He could not, however, recall where exactly he had walked or who might have seen him. His phone had no location data for that period, having been set to airplane mode since the previous evening, a detail he later insisted was to minimize distractions during shareholder meetings. Investigators began quietly constructing a list of persons of interest, and the early suspicion hovered squarely over Will. Still, they were methodical. Chloe Ramirez, the assistant who discovered the body, was briefly held for questioning. She had been the first on the scene and had access to the apartment, but she presented irrefutable GPS evidence from her apartment in Wicker Park, showing she had been home all morning and early afternoon. Her testimony was calm but detailed. She described entering a silent, immaculately arranged apartment and noted with unease that the temperature felt slightly cooler than usual, as if the windows had been cracked earlier and closed again. Another early suspect was Jared Pennington, Varian's recently dismissed head of security, let go under opaque circumstances on October 12th after an internal dispute over what he later described in interviews as internal wrongdoing. Jared had sent several combative emails to Will and Veronica in the days following his termination, some of which were recovered and later unsealed by subpoena. In one, dated October 23rd, he warned Will, "You don't get to silence everyone just because you've got more money." When interviewed by police, Jared admitted to being angry, but maintained that on the day of Veronica's death, he was in Nashville, Tennessee, attending a security technology expo. Hotel keycard logs and a parking timestamp from his rental vehicle confirmed his alibi. With other suspects falling away, the investigation turned inward. Forensics turned up an unsettling detail. A pair of disposable blue nitrile gloves found in a kitchen trash bin bore trace amounts of Veronica's blood. One glove was crumpled and torn at the wrist seam. The other, inexplicably clean, yielded no fingerprints or DNA at all. There was no explanation as to why medical-grade gloves were in the trash. According to Rosa, they were not kept in the apartment. The autopsy also noted a bruise across Veronica's right forearm, a defensive injury sustained roughly within minutes of death. What began to trouble investigators most, however, was the building timeline. S. body had not gone unnoticed for more than 10 minutes after her estimated time of death. Yet in those crucial 10 minutes, someone had managed to inflict a fatal injury, possibly attempt strangulation. But just hours before the first flute of champagne was to be poured, and guests were to arrive at the couple's penthouse at 950 North Michigan Avenue, everything unraveled. At 3:29 p.m., Veronica's longtime assistant, Chloe Ramirez, entered the master bedroom to find her employer lifeless on the floor, blood soaking into the designer rug, a shattered glass nearby catching the late afternoon light. Panic gripped the building within minutes, and by 4:02 p.m., homicide detectives were at the scene. What followed over the next several months would be one of the most scandalous and closely watched murder investigations in recent Chicago history, revealing an unraveling marriage, a web of financial deception, and a man whose mask of success may have hidden the simmering fear of everything coming undone. The Hargroves were no strangers to public adoration. William Hargrove, known as Will to those in his inner circle, was the 42-year-old CEO of Variant Systems, a tech company contracted for high-level AI infrastructure projects, some with federal implications. Those who worked under him described him as intense, calculating, and unflinchingly strategic. His wife, Veronica, aged 39, was admired throughout the philanthropic community for her work with disadvantaged youth through her nonprofit, the Chicago Youth Hope Foundation, and was often hailed in media profiles as a modern woman of substance and style. Publicly, they appeared to be a model couple, frequent guests at political fundraisers, front-row attendees at art exhibitions, and contributors to civic planning committees. But according to interviews conducted during the investigation, that facade had begun to crack in the weeks leading up to her death. One of Veronica's close friends and a board member of her foundation, Eleanor Saunders, told detectives that Veronica had begun to express quiet distress, concerns about Will's mood shifts, his obsessive need for control over both business and personal affairs, and the growing distance between them. According to Saunders, Veronica confided that Will had recently become emotionally detached, increasingly paranoid, and had moved out of the marital bed, citing stress, though she suspected deeper issues. This was further corroborated by Chloe Ramirez, who shared in sworn testimony that Veronica had grown fearful, not of infidelity, but of something more slippery, something hidden behind the business suits and investor calls. The day of the gala began like any other. Rosa Montoya, the housekeeper of 7 years, arrived at 7:10 a.m. and found Veronica alone on the balcony with coffee in hand. Rosa later described her as quiet, but not sad, thoughtful, like she was memorizing everything. By 9:30 a.m., Will left for Varian's West Loop offices, citing preparations for a late-morning shareholder call. Office security footage later confirmed his presence there starting at 10:01 a.m. At 12:45 p.m., Veronica left the building briefly in a rush, stopping by a florist in River North to check on custom centerpieces she had ordered, something Rosa said she never left to staff, even when things were busy. Just after 3 p.m., Chloe arrived with decor samples and texted Veronica to be let up, only to discover her elevator card had been deactivated. Security let her in manually. Upon entering the penthouse, Chloe noted everything appeared perfectly arranged for the evening event. She moved toward the master suite, expecting to find Veronica, finalizing details or perhaps touching up makeup, but instead, she stepped into a scene she would later describe as frozen in a terrible kind of peace. Veronica's body was found near the edge of the bed, dressed in a champagne-colored silk robe, the back of her head visibly injured, blood pooled beneath. The master bedroom showed no signs of forced entry or disturbance, no overturned furniture, no visible struggle. The only anomaly, aside from the body, was a single shattered champagne flute on the floor and, as would later be noted, the distinct absence of Veronica's phone. Will Hargrove, contacted shortly after by police, returned to the scene visibly shaken, and according to Detective Carla Neely, who led the case, appeared stunned, but not disoriented, like someone already imagining the fallout. An initial canvass of building security and maintenance staff yielded no unusual entries or disturbances that day. Surveillance confirmed no unauthorized access to the penthouse level floors. It was, on the surface, a sealed and controlled environment, and yet, someone had murdered Veronica Hargrove between the hours of 2:30 p.m. and 3:10 p.m. in a locked home, during broad daylight, and just hours before she was expected to greet hundreds of guests in that very space. The city's elite were left stunned, and investigators would soon learn that the life of privilege and polish that surrounded the Hargroves concealed not just one, but several slow-burning secrets that had been edging toward eruption for years. The crime scene presented contradictions that immediately unsettled investigators. Remove a lamp, wipe the scene of overt blood evidence, dispose of gloves, erased phone data, and exit a heavily monitored luxury building. Without a single camera capturing the departure, prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and destruction of evidence, citing a pattern of calculated behavior intended to prevent exposure of financial crimes through the silencing of a primary whistleblower, namely his wife, Veronica Hargrove. The arrest was made without incident outside a private members club in River North, where Will had been seen meeting with Brent Caffey just days before. In the affidavit, investigators outlined the critical sequence that unraveled his alibi. Cellular tower triangulation showed a brief but telling signal ping from Will's phone despite being in airplane mode, connecting momentarily to a rogue Wi-Fi signal in the vicinity of the Penthouse during the 2 p.m. hour, likely a software slip caused by a previously connected device auto-pairing without manual input. That data, paired with footage from a traffic camera just 2 blocks from his building, capturing a man resembling Will walking briskly toward the service alley behind 950 North Michigan at 2:19 p.m., cemented the timeline. The missing lamp was never recovered, but traces of brass oxide, consistent with its finish, were found embedded in the wound on Veronica's skull. A deeper forensic sweep of the Hargrove's luxury SUV, impounded in early January, revealed specks of her blood beneath the rear cargo mat, microscopic and out of place. Prosecutors alleged that the lamp had been placed there after the murder, though defense attorneys argued the blood transfer could have come from first responders or residual contamination. Will pled not guilty and retained defense attorney Leonard Flynn, a well-known figure in Chicago's white-collar criminal defense circles. Flynn quickly painted the case as speculative and media-driven, leaning heavily on the lack of direct eyewitnesses, the incomplete DNA profiles, and the suggestion that others, including Veronica's assistant Chloe Ramirez, and even Holly Mercer, had both motive and access. But the defense unraveled when a sealed witness came forward. A Varian IT administrator named Daniel Sheen, who claimed under immunity that Will had ordered him, on November 1st, the day before the gala, to wipe a phone completely clean, then throw it in the lake, a request he had refused. Sheen also claimed Will instructed him to create false timestamps on an internal messaging log to show communications with clients during the 2 p.m. hour on November 2nd, though these were never transmitted and left a forensic trail. During trial, which began on June 3, 2024, the prosecution emphasized Veronica's increasing isolation in the final months of her life using text logs, foundation, board memos, and testimony from Eleanor Sanders to show that she had uncovered at least $2.4 million in misallocated funds. Her efforts to confront Will privately had escalated into a quiet war of attrition, with her preparing to go public. The gala, they argued, was to be a statement of independence, a final image of strength before blowing the whistle, an event that would have humiliated Will publicly and likely destroyed his federal contracts. Will's defense faltered in the face of mounting technical evidence, especially when Holly Mercer was subpoenaed to testify. Though reluctant, she confirmed that her relationship with Will had turned manipulative and coercive, and that, in the final week of October, he had confided in her that Veronica's about to go new. She interpreted the phrase as figurative until the murder. In a rare, emotionally charged moment on the stand, she said, "I think I was the insurance policy. If anything went wrong, he needed someone else to absorb the fallout." The defense objected. The judge sustained, but the jury had already felt the shift. On June 27th, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Will Hargrove guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The aftermath of the case was seismic. Varian Systems collapsed within 3 weeks of the verdict, with federal investigations into its contract history unearthing additional layers of fraud. The Chicago Youth Hope Foundation was temporarily dissolved and reorganized under new leadership, with many of its donors stunned by how close it had come to being a financial front. For those who had known Veronica Hargrove, not just as a public figure but as a private woman navigating the tightening coils of deceit, the verdict was a hollow kind of justice. As Eleanor Sanders said in a final interview, she didn't want out of the marriage. She wanted to fix the truth. She thought he'd come clean. But some men don't fear loss. They fear being seen. And when she tried to bring everything into the light, he made sure the light went out first. The Penthouse on Michigan Avenue sold quietly in the fall, stripped of all the Hargrove furnishings. But the blood-stained section of rug, where everything had ended, was removed by police and remains in evidence storage. An ugly, silent fragment of a life once celebrated, then shattered, in the heart of the city. Forensics would later find faint footprints on the Penthouse balcony, prints that matched Will's shoe size, but were too partial to positively identify. As pressure mounted, Will remained visibly composed in public, attending Veronica's private memorial at the Fourth Presbyterian Church on November 5th, dressed in black, speaking little, though several attendees would later report that his face was disturbingly blank, as if he were already grieving something beyond her death. Then, 6 days after the murder, Veronica's missing phone resurfaced, or at least, its shattered shell did. On November 6th, a city maintenance worker noticed an object wedged in a drainage grate near Kinsey Street, along the south bank of the Chicago River. Divers were dispatched, and by the end of the day, they had recovered the bent frame of a rose gold iPhone. Though it had been reset and powered off, digital forensic specialists were able to extract trace data. Inside the casing, DNA analysis identified partial matches for both Will Hargrove and an unidentified female contributor. That female's identity remains redacted in court filings, but sources close to the case later confirmed that Holly Mercer, a 27-year-old data analyst from Verian, had resigned abruptly 2 days after the murder, citing health concerns and irreconcilable professional boundaries. Though Holly declined all media interviews, a subpoenaed resignation letter obtained during pretrial hearings included an ominous line: "I no longer feel safe working in an environment where transparency is punished." Interviews with Verian staff would reveal whispers of a relationship between Will and Holly, emotional, possibly physical. One colleague claimed that Veronica had shown up unannounced at the office in mid-October and spent 10 minutes alone in a conference room with Holly. Nobody knew what was said, but according to 2 staffers, Holly emerged shaken and pale, telling one coworker, "She knows everything." With this emerging backdrop of corporate secrecy, strained loyalties, and potential infidelity, the case took on a deeper and darker dimension. In parallel, financial investigators discovered a second ledger system buried in encrypted backups from Veronica's foundation. Documents that showed irregular transfers from charitable accounts to entities with ties to defense contractors, one of which traced back to a holding company co-founded by Will's college roommate, Brent Caffey, a man previously under sex scrutiny for securities violations. Veronica, it seemed, had been quietly gathering evidence, piecing together a pattern of siphoning funds meant for youth education grants into shell accounts linked to high-margin federal tech contracts. In a never-sent email recovered from her drafts folder, she wrote, "You don't get to steal from children to buy silence. You, Dante, get to wear my face in public and strip me of voice in private." Dated October 30th. 3 days before her death. The message had been addressed to Will at VIR on sys.com and bore the subject line, "With motive becoming sharper and forensic evidence stacking." The picture that emerged was of a woman who had begun preparing for confrontation, and of a man whose carefully engineered empire may have been a facade cracking at the edges under the weight of exposure. The gloves in the trash, the missing lamp, the phone in the river, the unexplained 35-minute gap. None of them proved guilt outright, but together, they formed a silhouette of intent. By the end of the second week, investigators were no longer asking who might have wanted Veronica Hargrove silenced. They were asking who, of those closest to her, had the means, the opportunity, and most of all, the desperation. In the months that followed, the case against Will Hargrove shifted from quietly circumstantial to sharply culminating in his arrest on February 14, 2024, following a sealed indictment handed down by a Cook County grand jury.